There are secrets that sleep beside us for entire decades. Secrets that breathe on the same pillow, eat at the same table, and grow old with us without ever being revealed. For 40 years, every night at dawn, my husband would open a box from under our bed and cry in silence. I pretended to be asleep. When I finally discovered what was inside that box, I understood why he could never close his eyes in peace. My name is Dorothy. I'm 75 years old, and I spent most of my life with a man I thought I knew. Today, I come here to share with you a story I've kept in my chest since the day I buried my husband. A story about love, about secrets, and about how sometimes the truth only appears when it's too late to change anything. Before I begin, I'd like to ask a little favor from you. If you can, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary to help me continue telling these stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It makes me so happy to know there are people from so many different places listening to what this old woman has to say. Well, I'll start from the beginning. It was 1965. I had just turned 18 when my mother came into my room with that serious look I knew well. She sat on the edge of my bed and said she had a marriage proposal for me. Back then, here in rural Kentucky, things worked differently. Parents would talk among themselves, work out the details, and we'd only find out when everything was practically decided. It wasn't like today where young people date, get to know each other, choose who they want to marry. We accepted what life offered, and that was it. His name was Theodore Augustus Stevens. The first time I heard that name, I thought it was handsome, distinguished. My mother said he was 26, worked at Mr. Henderson's farm. He was a serious, hard-working man, and his family was well regarded in town. She said he had asked for my hand in marriage through his father, Mr. Otis, and my father had already accepted. I barely knew the man. I had seen him a few times at Sunday Mass, always quiet in the back pew of the church, hat in hand, and eyes fixed on the altar. He was handsome. I couldn't deny that. Tall, dark-haired, with dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. But there was something about him that made me uneasy, a sadness that seemed so old it had become part of his face. We got to know each other better in the 3 weeks before the wedding. He would come to my house on Sundays after Mass, always accompanied by his mother, Mrs. Helen, a short woman with white hair who spoke little and sighed a lot. We would sit in the living room, drink coffee, eat the cornbread my mother made, and try to talk. But Theodore was a man of few words. He would answer what I asked politely, but never started conversations, never looked me in the eyes for very long. He seemed to always be somewhere else, even sitting right there beside me. I remember once I asked him what he liked to do in his spare time. He was silent for several seconds, as if he had to think hard to answer something so simple, then said he liked to fish at the creek on Saturday afternoons. I asked if he had siblings. He said no, that he was an only child, that his mother had 2 other babies before him, but both had died young. His voice got even lower when he said this, and Mrs. Helen pulled out the rosary from her pocket and began praying quietly. I didn't know how to continue the conversation after that. On our wedding day, October 23, 1965, the church was full. My mother had insisted on inviting the whole town. I was wearing a white dress that had belonged to my grandmother, all hand-embroidered, with lace on the hem that my Aunt Geneva had spent 2 weeks making. I had a long veil and a bouquet of white roses that my father had specially ordered from Louisville. When I entered the church on my father's arm, I saw Theodore waiting for me at the altar. He was in a black suit, tie, hair slicked back with pomade. He looked handsome. But when our eyes met, I saw that same sadness as always. He tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. The ceremony was beautiful. Father Anthony gave a homily about the sacrament of marriage, about how marriage was a union blessed by God, about how we two were beginning a sacred journey together. Theodore repeated the vows with a firm voice, but without emotion, as if he were reciting a memorized lesson. When it came time to put the ring on my finger, his hand trembled. It was just for a second, but I noticed. And I also noticed that he closed his eyes when the priest said he could kiss the bride. It was a quick kiss, almost formal, more like a respectful greeting than anything else. The reception was at my parents' house. There was a fiddle band, plenty of food. There was Mrs. Zelma's famous apple pie that was known throughout the county. Everyone danced, drank, laughed, told jokes, except Theodore. He sat next to me the entire party, talking when someone came to speak with him, but always with that distant air. When my cousin William came to congratulate us and joked that we'd have about 10 children because I was pretty and Theodore was strong, he just smiled weakly and took another sip of beer. At the end of the night, we went to the house his father had prepared for us. It was a simple house with 3 rooms at the end of Main Street. It had a small living room with a sofa and coffee table, a bedroom with a double bed that Mrs. Helen had made up with embroidered white sheets, and a kitchen in the back with a wood-burning stove. There was also a backyard with an apple tree and a chicken coop with 5 hens. It was all very modest, but clean and organized. When we entered the bedroom for the first time as husband and wife, my heart was beating so hard I thought he would hear it. I was a virgin, of course. I didn't know what to expect. My mother had given me some vague guidance about a wife's duties, but nothing very specific. Theodore closed the door behind us and stood still for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he began to take off his jacket, tie, unbutton his shirt. I stood there, not knowing what to do, until he said quietly that I could change clothes too, that he would turn off the light. What happened that night was quick and mechanical. It wasn't violent, it wasn't painful in the sense that he was rough with me, but it was empty. It was as if he were fulfilling an obligation, doing something that needed to be done, but that gave him no pleasure at all. When it was over, he turned his back and fell silent. I lay there, looking at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the crickets outside, wondering if this was how it would be forever. I thought he would sleep, that we would sleep, and the next day life would really begin, that with time things would get better, that we would get used to each other. But then I heard a strange noise, movement. I opened my eyes and saw his silhouette sitting on the edge of the bed. He was bent forward, as if looking for something. I heard the sound of something being dragged from under the bed, a box. He took a shoebox. I pretended to be asleep. I don't know why. Maybe out of fear. Maybe because I thought if I pretended not to see, it wouldn't be so strange. But I was watching. Through the crack of my half-closed eyes, I saw everything. Theodore took that shoebox, a light brown box with a lid, and held it in his lap. And then I heard a sob. Quietly, but it was a sob. My husband, on our first night as newlyweds, was crying, holding a shoebox. He didn't open the box. That was the strangest part. He just sat there holding it, crying silently, his shoulders shaking from time to time. I didn't know what to do. Should I pretend to wake up? Should I ask what was happening? Should I hug him? But something told me this was a private moment for him, that he didn't want me to see, that if I revealed I was awake, it would be worse. So I continued pretending to sleep. After about 20 minutes, he wiped his face with the back of his hand, put the box back under the bed, lay on his back, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't sleep all night. I know because I didn't sleep either. In the following days, I tried to act normal. He would leave early in the morning to work on the farm. He'd come back in the late afternoon, tired and dirty from the earth. He'd bathe in the tub in the backyard, eat what I prepared, then sit in the living room smoking one cigarette after another until bedtime. We talked little. I tried to start conversations, asked how his day had been, told him something that had happened with the neighbors, but he only responded with monosyllables. He wasn't rude, just distant, and every night the same thing. He would wait for me to turn off the light, wait a few more minutes, and then take the box from under the bed, always at the same time. 3 a.m. I began to wake up on my own at this time, even before he moved. It was as if my body had created an internal alarm, and every night I pretended to be asleep while he took that box, held it, cried quietly, and then put it back. He never opened the box, never took anything out, just held it as if he were embracing something or someone. Weeks passed, then months. My period was late. I went to the midwife, Mrs. Sebastian, and she confirmed I was expecting a baby. When I told Theodore, he just nodded and said it was a blessing from God. There was no hug, no celebration, no joy I imagined a husband would have when learning he was going to be a father. Just a formal acknowledgement that life was following its natural course. The pregnancy was difficult. I had a lot of morning sickness, dizziness, swelling. Mrs. Helen came to help me a few times a week. She was kind to me, but also a woman of few words, just like her son. Once I tried to ask her if Theodore had always been like this, so quiet, so closed off. She stopped what she was doing, looked at me with eyes full of sadness, and said that since he was a young man, since he was 24, he had changed a lot, that he had suffered a very great loss, and was never the same. I asked what loss that was, but she shook her head and said it wasn't her place to talk about her son's life, that everyone carried their crosses the way they could. That stayed in my head. What loss? Theodore had lost someone, a friend, a close relative. And what did this have to do with that box? I began to pay more attention. I noticed he got worse in August. Every August, since we'd been married, he became even quieter, even sadder. In August 1966, when I was already 7 months pregnant, he spent the entire month like a ghost in the house. He barely ate, barely spoke, and at dawn, with the box, he cried louder. It was no longer just a silent sob, it was desperate crying, the crying of someone with a broken heart. Our daughter was born in January 1967. We named her Christine, after both our grandmothers. She was a beautiful baby, chubby, with dark eyes just like her father's. When the midwife placed her in Theodore's arms for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before, a tear rolling down his face. Just one tear that he wiped away quickly, but it was there. He looked at that tiny baby, ran his finger on her cheek, and whispered something I couldn't hear. At that moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, that baby would accomplish what I couldn't. Bring him back to life. But that's not how it happened. Theodore was a present father. I can't say otherwise. He worked hard to provide, never let us lack anything. He helped with Christine when she cried at night, but remained distant, continued with that emptiness in his gaze, and continued with the ritual of the box. Every dawn, 3 a.m., for years and years and years. Christine grew up, became a smart, talkative girl, full of life. She adored her father, and he showed affection for her the way he could. He would take her fishing at the creek on Saturdays, teach her to plant in the garden, make paper kites for her to fly. But even with his daughter, even seeing that child grow and fill the house with joy, Theodore never stopped being that sad man and never stopped reaching for the box at dawn. Over the years, I got used to it. It's strange to say that, but it's true. We get used to almost everything when we have no other choice. I built my life around that. I took care of the house, raised Christine, made friends with the neighbors, went to Mass, participated in church activities. Theodore was my husband, my daughter's father, the man I shared a bed with every night. But he was never truly my companion. He was never my friend. He was never my love. And I learned to accept that. There was one time, this was in 1978, when Christine was about 10, 11 years old, that I almost asked. It was during a night when I had insomnia because I was worried about some back pain I'd been having. Theodore took the box, as always, and sat on the edge of the bed. I was with my eyes open looking at him. He saw me. Our eyes met in the dark. For a second, I thought he was going to say something, that finally he would explain, but he just looked away, put the box under the bed hurriedly, lay on his back, and stayed quiet. Neither of us said anything, and the next day everything continued as always. The years went by and we grew old together. Christine grew up, married a good man named John Baptist, moved to Louisville. We were left just the two of us in the house. The silence became even heavier. Theodore retired in 1992 after more than 30 years working on the farm. I thought with him home all day things would change, that we would finally really talk. But no. He would wake up early, make coffee, tend the garden, sit on the sofa listening to the radio. And at dawn, 3 a.m., the same thing as always. The box, the silent crying, the secret he carried and would never tell me. I continued pretending not to know anything for all those years. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of waking up at 3 a.m. pretending to be asleep, 40 years wondering what was in that box, 40 years living with a man I knew, but who at the same time was a complete stranger to me. And then came the day when everything changed. It was August 2005. Theodore had just turned 66 the month before. I was 58. We were already an old couple, the kind people look at on the street and think have been together their whole lives, know each other inside and out, have no more secrets from each other. If they only knew the truth. That August, Theodore was worse than ever. Every year, during that cursed month, he became different, but that year was especially difficult. He barely ate. I made the food he liked, that chicken stew with okra that had always been his favorite dish, and he would move it around his plate with his fork without taking almost anything to his mouth. He lost so much weight in those weeks that his pants became loose on him, his eyes sunken, his cheeks hollow. He looked 10 years older from 1 month to the next. I tried to talk. For the first time in decades, I really tried to ask what was happening. It was on a Sunday afternoon after lunch. We were sitting on the porch, he smoking his hand-rolled cigarette as always, looking at nothing. I gathered courage and asked if he didn't want to go to the doctor, that I was worried about him, that he wasn't well. Theodore looked at me, took a long drag on his cigarette, and said he didn't need a doctor, that everything was fine. But his voice trembled. And for the first time in all those years, I saw fear in his eyes. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was fear. I asked what he was afraid of. He was silent for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said in a voice so low I almost didn't hear that he was afraid of forgetting. Forgetting what? I asked. But he had already gotten up, thrown the rest of the cigarette on the ground, stepped on it, and gone inside the house. The conversation was over. That night, I woke up at 3 a.m. as always. My body was already so accustomed to that time, it was automatic. I slowly opened my eyes and waited. But Theodore didn't move. He was lying on his side, his back to me, breathing slowly. I found it strange. In 40 years, he had never missed his ritual. Never. I stayed there waiting, thinking maybe he was waiting for me to go back to sleep. But 10, 15, 20 minutes passed and nothing. Then I heard a different sound in his breathing. It wasn't the breathing of someone sleeping. It was the breathing of someone crying, trying not to make noise. For the first time, I felt like reaching out and touching him, putting my hand on his back and saying I was there, that he didn't have to carry this alone, whatever it was. My hand was already in the air, almost touching him when he spoke. Without turning around, without looking at me, he said my name. Dorothy. Just that, my name. And then he said he was sorry. Sorry for everything. Sorry I had spent my whole life next to a man who couldn't love me the way I deserved. I was paralyzed. In 40 years of marriage, those were the deepest words he had ever said to me. I didn't know what to answer. I stayed there lying with my hand still in the air, trembling, feeling tears run down my face. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to say I knew, that I had always known he didn't love me, that I had accepted that long ago. I wanted to say I was sorry too for not being brave enough to ask, to try to understand. I wanted to say maybe we could have been happy somehow if we had really talked at least once in our lives. But I couldn't say anything. I just lightly touched my hand to his back, very gently, and stayed like that until the sun rose. The next day, he woke up earlier than normal. When I came down to the kitchen, he had already made coffee, set the table, and was sitting with his cup in hand, looking out the window. "Good morning," I said. He responded, "Good morning too," but didn't look at me. We drank coffee in silence. Then he said he was going for a walk, that he needed some fresh air. I asked if he wanted company, but he said he preferred to go alone. He left wearing his hat, long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, and his hands in his pockets. He was out all day. When he came back, it was almost night. I was worried. I had even thought about asking our neighbor, Mr. Morris, to go look for him. But then he appeared at the door, tired, his clothes all dusty. He sat in the kitchen chair and asked for a glass of water. I gave him the water. He drank it all at once. And then he looked at me. Really looked at me, into my eyes, for the first time in I don't know how many years, and said he was tired, very tired. I asked if he wanted to lie down, rest. He shook his head and said it wasn't that kind of tiredness. It was a tiredness of the soul, a tiredness from carrying what he had been carrying for so long. He said he was getting old, that he felt he didn't have much time left, and that he was tired of fighting against memories, that the memories were winning, that they were consuming him completely. At that moment, with him talking like that, looking at me like that, I thought he was finally going to tell me that he was going to open that box, show what was inside, explain everything. I pulled up a chair and sat next to him. I held his hand, which was cold despite the heat, and waited. But he didn't tell. He just squeezed my hand back hard, as if saying goodbye, and said, "Thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for being a good wife. Thank you for raising Christine so well. Thank you for not giving up on him, even though he hadn't given me any reason to stay." I cried. I cried there in front of him, without hiding, without pretending. I cried for all those years of silence. I cried for the loneliness we had shared inside that house. I cried for the marriage we never really had. And I cried because at that moment, seeing him like that, so fragile, so broken, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt pity for him. It wasn't love. It never was love. But it was deep compassion for that man who had spent his whole life trapped in something I didn't understand. He wiped my tears with his calloused hand. It was such a delicate gesture, so full of care that it made me cry even more. Then he got up, said he was going to take a bath and go to bed early because he was exhausted. I went to the kitchen to finish washing the dinner dishes he hadn't eaten. I stood there scrubbing the plates, looking out the window at the dark backyard, thinking about everything and nothing at the same time. When I went to the bedroom later, he was already lying down. He seemed to be sleeping. I lay on my side of the bed, turned off the light, and stared at the ceiling, waiting for 3 a.m. I wanted to see if he was going to take the box. I wanted to see if after that strange conversation we'd had, the ritual would continue. But sleep caught me first. I slept deeply, for the first time in years, without waking up at dawn. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the sun was already high. I looked to the side, and Theodore was still lying with his back to me. I found it strange because he always woke up early. I called his name. Theodore. Nothing. I called again, louder. Nothing. Then I touched his shoulder. It was cold. What happened next was all very fast and very slow at the same time. I remember shaking him, screaming his name, running to Mr. Morris's house asking for help. I remember Mr. Morris running back with me, entering the bedroom, checking Theodore's pulse, looking at me and shaking his head. I remember collapsing on the floor. I remember Mrs. Morris hugging me and crying with me. I remember someone going to call the doctor, Dr. Gerald, who lived 3 streets away. I remember Dr. Gerald examining Theodore's body and saying it had been his heart, that it had been quick, that he hadn't suffered, that he had died in his sleep. But he hadn't died in his sleep. I knew that. He had died tired, tired of carrying that weight, tired of fighting against memories. He had given up. They called Christine in Louisville. She arrived in the late afternoon with her husband and their 2 children, my grandchildren Robert and Victoria, who were already teenagers. Christine hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She cried and said it couldn't be true, that she had talked to her father on the phone 2 weeks ago, and he was fine. He wasn't fine, I thought. He hadn't been fine for a long time, but I didn't say anything. The wake was at home, as was customary at the time. They set up the coffin in the living room. Theodore was lying there in his suit, hands crossed over his chest, with that face that finally seemed at peace. The whole town came to pay their respects. Mrs. Helen, who was already in her 80s and hardly left the house anymore, insisted on coming. She stood in front of her son's coffin for a long time, holding her rosary, praying quietly, crying in silence. When she left, she hugged me and whispered in my ear that I had been a much better wife than Theodore deserved. I didn't understand what she meant by that. The funeral was the next day. The cemetery was full. Father Anthony, who was already quite elderly too, held a beautiful mass. He talked about eternal life, about the rest of the righteous, about how Theodore had been a hard-working and honorable man. When they lowered the coffin, Christine threw herself on top of it, crying that she didn't want them to bury her father. John Baptist had to hold her. I stood there still, dry, unable to cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I was still in shock. I still hadn't fully grasped that he was gone, that he had taken his secret with him. We returned home after the burial. Christine wanted me to go to Louisville to live with her, but I said no, that this was my home, that I needed to stay here. She stayed with me 3 more days and then left, making me promise I would call every week and that if I needed anything, I should just say so. When they left and I was finally alone in that house, the silence was deafening. I spent the first days like a ghost, doing things automatically. I would wake up, make coffee, drink it alone, wash the cup, sweep the house, cook food, eat a little, wash the dishes again, and at night lie in that huge, empty bed and look at the ceiling, waiting for 3 a.m. It was a habit my body couldn't break. Even with him dead, I would wake up at 3 a.m. and stay there, looking at the empty space beside me, remembering the ritual he had maintained for 40 years. It was on the 5th night alone that I thought about the box for the first time since he had died. I had been so concerned with the wake, the funeral, the relatives, the papers, that it hadn't even crossed my mind. But that night, when I woke up at 3 a.m., I remembered. The box, the shoebox he had kept under the bed for 40 years. It was still there. I sat up in bed. My heart raced. I turned on the bedside lamp. I looked under the bed on his side, and there it was. The same light brown box I had seen so many times, always glimpsed, always pretending not to see. I stared at it for a time I can't say how long it was. It could have been a minute, could have been 10. My hand trembled when I reached out and pulled the box out. It was lighter than I imagined. I took it with both hands and placed it in my lap, the same way I had seen him do so many times. There was dust accumulated on the lid. I ran my hand cleaning it. The box was old, faded, with worn edges. It had a label from a shoe store in Louisville that didn't exist anymore. I sat there holding that box, feeling its weight, so light, but at the same time so heavy for what it represented. I thought about opening it. I thought about finally discovering what was inside there, but at the same time, I felt like I was invading something, that this belonged to him, that even with him dead, that secret was still his. And I didn't have the right to violate that. I stayed in this internal conflict for so long that when I looked at the clock, it was almost 5 a.m. I put the box back under the bed and tried to sleep, but couldn't. In the following days, the box didn't leave my mind. I did the household chores thinking about it. I went to the market thinking about it, talked to the neighbors thinking about it. At night, when I lay down, I looked under the bed, knowing it was there. And every dawn at 3 a.m., I woke up wanting to take it, but didn't. Something held me back. Until one night, 2 weeks after the burial, I couldn't stand it anymore. I woke up at 3 a.m., as always. I turned on the light, took the box, placed it in my lap, and looked at it for a long time. This time, I was going to open it. I needed to know. I needed to understand who had been that man I had spent 40 years of my life with. I needed to understand what had been so important that he cried every dawn for 4 decades. I took a deep breath, put my hand on the lid, and opened it. What was inside changed everything I thought I knew about Theodore. Changed everything I thought about our marriage. Changed everything I thought about myself. Inside that box was the explanation for 40 years of silence, 40 years of sadness, 40 years of a secret so painful it had consumed an entire man. And for the first time in all those decades, I understood. I understood everything. My hands were trembling so much I almost dropped the box. I had to hold it firmly, breathe deeply several times before I could really look inside. And when I looked, what I saw first were photographs. Many photographs, all in black and white, some already yellowed at the edges, with that smell of old things that old paper has. I carefully took the first photo, as if it would fall apart in my fingers. It was a young woman, a beautiful young woman with dark, long, wavy hair falling over her shoulders. She was wearing a white lace dress with short sleeves and a thin belt at the waist. The dress was clearly a bridal dress, but not a complete wedding dress. It was simpler, more delicate. The young woman was smiling at the camera, a huge smile, one of those that shows all the teeth, one of those that makes the eyes shine. She was holding a bouquet of wildflowers, daisies, and other field flowers. She was beautiful. She was radiant. She was in love. You could see that just by looking at the photo. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in careful handwriting that I didn't recognize, was Isabel, June, 1964. Isabel. That name meant nothing to me. I had never heard Theodore mention any Isabel. I had never heard Mrs. Helen mention that name. But there she was, inside the box my husband had guarded so carefully for 40 years. I took the second photo. It was the same young woman, Isabel, but this time she was with a young man. My heart almost stopped when I recognized the young man. It was Theodore, but a Theodore I had never seen. A young Theodore who must have been about 23, 24 years old, and he was smiling, really smiling. It wasn't that forced yellow smile he gave in the few photos we had taken throughout our marriage. It was a genuine smile, wide, happy. He had his arm around her waist, pulling her close, and she was leaning into him, her head almost on his shoulder, laughing. They both looked so happy it hurt to look at that photo. I continued looking at the other photographs. There were several. Isabel alone in different places, always smiling. Isabel and Theodore sitting by a creek with their feet in the water. Isabel and Theodore in front of a small church I didn't recognize. Isabel in a floral dress, holding a straw hat and making a funny pose. In all the photos, that happiness was palpable. It was a happiness that screamed from inside those black and white images. A happiness that contrasted so much with the sadness I had seen on Theodore's face during all the years I knew him. I carefully set the photos aside, organizing them on the bed. I looked back inside the box. There were more things. I took what appeared to be a rosary. The beads were wooden, some cracked. The metal crucifix was broken in half. That rosary had been used a lot, that was obvious. The beads were worn, smooth from being touched so much. Why would a broken rosary be in there? Under the rosary was a ring, a simple gold ring with a small blue stone set in it. It was an engagement ring, I realized. I took it and looked inside. It was engraved, T&I 1964, Theodore and Isabel. So they had been engaged. Theodore had been engaged before marrying me, and he had kept her ring all those years. I felt something strange in my chest. It wasn't exactly jealousy. How could I be jealous of someone I didn't even know, who had clearly been part of his life long before me? But it was a pain of realizing he had loved someone that way, with that intensity that showed through in the photos, and that with me, he had never felt even a fraction of that. I had always known he didn't love me, but seeing proof that he was capable of love, just that he hadn't been able to love me, that hurt in a way I didn't expect. I continued searching through the box. There were letters, several letters tied with a faded red string. I untied them carefully. I took the first letter. The paper was yellowed, fragile. I opened it slowly so as not to tear it. The handwriting was Theodore's. I recognized it immediately. It was the same handwriting he used to sign documents, to write shopping lists, that he sometimes left me when he needed me to buy something specific. But the handwriting in the letters was different, more careful, more beautiful, as if he had put all the love in the world into each written word. The first letter began like this: "My beloved Isabel, each day away from you is an eternity. I wake up thinking of you, spend the day counting the hours to see you again, and sleep with your name on my lips. You are the reason for everything. You are my gift from God. I can barely wait for the day when you will be my wife and we can finally build our life together. Yours forever, Theodore." I had to stop reading. Tears were blurring my vision. That man who had written those words, full of love, full of hope, full of life, was not the man I knew. The man I knew was an empty shell. But that man in the letters, that was the real Theodore. That was the man he had been before something destroyed him inside. I read more letters. They were all similar. Declarations of love, plans for the future, dreams they had together. In one, he talked about the house he wanted to build for her, with a big yard where she could plant the flowers she loved. In another, he talked about the children they would have, how many names he had already thought of, how he would teach the boys to fish and the girls to read. In yet another, he told about how he had saved every penny of his salary to be able to buy the engagement ring, how he had gone to Louisville just to choose a ring worthy of her. The last letter was different. It wasn't finished. It seemed he had started writing and stopped in the middle. It was dated August 1964. The letter said, "My dear Isabel, tomorrow is the big day. Tomorrow you will walk to the altar and become my wife. I can't sleep from so much anxiety, so much happiness. I went to the church today, and Father Anthony is getting everything ready. Your mother has finished sewing your dress. My mother made the cake. Everything is ready. All that's missing is for you to arrive beautiful as always and say yes. My heart is so full, I think it will explode. You are everything I ever wanted, everything I ever dreamed of. I will spend the rest of my life making you happy. I promise. I will." And the letter stopped there. I will. He hadn't finished the sentence, hadn't finished the letter. Why? I went back to the box. There was one more thing at the bottom, a piece of newspaper folded carefully. I unfolded it. It was a page from a newspaper from August 1964, the Kentucky Herald, a newspaper that circulated in our region at that time. There was an article circled in red pen. I read the title, "Young Woman Drowns on Eve of Wedding." My heart raced. I read the entire article, every word, every comma. The story told that a 20-year-old young woman named Isabel Mendez had drowned in the Green River on the afternoon of August 23, 1964. She had gone to the river with some friends to fetch water and wash some clothes. It was customary at the time. Many people still didn't have running water at home and used the river for these things. According to witnesses, Isabel had slipped on the rocks at the bank and fallen into the deep part of the river. The current was strong due to rains from previous days. The friends tried to help but couldn't reach her in time. When they pulled the body from the water, she was already dead. The article said Isabel was to be married the next day to a young man from town, that the family was devastated, that the groom was in a state of shock and couldn't speak. It said the body would be waked at the family home and buried in the municipal cemetery. It said it was a tragedy that had shaken the entire community. I dropped the newspaper. My hands were shaking so much the paper fell to the floor. Isabel. Isabel had died one day before marrying Theodore. One day before. She had died drowning while he was probably finishing the last preparations for their wedding. She had died, and he was left there with the ring he had bought for her, with the letters he had written, with the dreams they had built together, with the love he had inside him and nowhere to put it all. I understood why he had stopped writing the letter. I understood why the letter ended with, "I will." He hadn't been able to finish because he was probably waiting for her to arrive the next day to give the letter along with all the others he had written during their courtship. But she never came, and he never finished the letter. I sat there in that bed with the photos scattered around me, with the letters in my lap, with that piece of newspaper on the floor, and tried to process all of that. Theodore had lost the love of his life in the most tragic way possible on the eve of their wedding, without warning, without a chance to say goodbye, without a chance to say everything he still wanted to say. And then, less than a year later, the family had pushed him into an arranged marriage with me to make him get over it, to make him move on, to make him forget. But he never forgot. How could he forget? He had kept that box with everything that was left of her, the photos, the letters, the ring, the rosary that was probably hers that had broken maybe in the accident, the news of the death. And he looked at that every dawn. Every dawn, for 40 years, he forced himself to remember, not to forget, but to not forget, to keep her alive somehow. I remembered what he had said to me that afternoon before he died, that he was afraid of forgetting. Now it made sense. He was afraid of forgetting Isabel, afraid that if he stopped looking at the photos, reading the letters, holding those objects, she would disappear completely. And for him, that would be dying again. It would be losing her for the second time. I understood why August was the worst month. Because it had been in August that she died. Every year when August came, he had to relive it all again. The expectation of the wedding, the happiness, and then the tragedy, the loss, the pain. I understood why he had never loved me. Not because he was incapable of love, but because all the love he had inside him, all that love that overflowed in the letters he had written, already had a recipient. And that recipient was dead. There was no room for anyone else. Nothing was left for me. I cried. I cried so much my body ached. I cried for him. I cried for Isabel, who had died so young, so full of life, one day before realizing her dream. I cried for the 40 years we had lived together, but separated. I cried for the life he could have had if she hadn't died. I cried for the life I could have had if I had married someone who could truly love me. But in the midst of all that pain, in the midst of all those tears, I also felt something else. I felt understanding. For the first time in 40 years, I understood Theodore. I understood the distance, the silence, the sadness in his eyes. I understood why he had never been able to be a real husband to me. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It wasn't because I had done something wrong. It was because he was trapped in August 1964. He was trapped forever on that day when the love of his life had disappeared under the water. I stayed there sitting in that bed until the sun rose. I looked at each photo carefully, read each letter slowly, held the ring in my palm, ran my fingers over the broken rosary beads, read and reread the newspaper article, and pieced together in my mind who that man had been before the tragedy. He had been happy, he had been in love, he had been full of dreams and plans, he had been a completely different person. And then he had met me, or rather, had been forced to marry me. And I had been the substitute, the woman who occupied the place that was meant to be Isabel's, the woman who slept in the bed that was meant to be hers, the woman who had the daughter that was meant to be hers. I had lived the life that was meant to be Isabel's. And Theodore had spent 40 years trying to deal with that, knowing that every time he looked at me, he remembered I wasn't her. I didn't feel anger. I could have. I had every right to. I could have felt angry at him for using me as a substitute. I could have felt angry at his family for arranging that marriage. I could have felt angry at life for being so unfair to me. But I didn't. I only felt immense sadness. Sadness for him, sadness for me, sadness for everything we could have been and never were. I carefully took all those things and put them back in the box. The photos organized, the letters tied again with the string, the ring, the rosary, the piece of newspaper. I closed the lid and held that box in my lap the same way he had held it for 40 years. And I understood why he cried. Because inside that box, there weren't just objects. There was an entire life that never happened. There was a future that was stolen. There was a love that was interrupted before it could be fully realized. There was Isabel, And even after 40 years, even after aging, even after building a family with someone else, he hadn't been able to let her go. Now I knew the secret. Now I understood. And strangely, that didn't make me feel worse. It made me feel lighter. Because finally, after a lifetime of questions without answers, I had the answers. Finally, everything made sense. Finally, I could stop wondering what I had done wrong, because I hadn't done anything wrong. I had just had the misfortune of loving a man who had already given his heart to someone else, someone who had taken that heart with her when she drowned in the river. And that morning, sitting in that bed with that box in my lap and the sun coming through the window, I made a decision. A decision that would change everything. A decision that would finally bring peace to me, and I hope bring peace to him too, wherever he was. I put the box back under the bed and sat there for a time I can't measure. It could have been an hour, could have been 3. The sun was already high when I finally got up. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, but couldn't drink it. I walked around the house, from one room to another, thinking, processing everything I had discovered. I had so many questions still, so many things that the photos and letters didn't explain. Who had Isabel been beyond what I had seen in those images? How had she and Theodore met? What had her family felt when she died? And his family, Mrs. Helen especially? What did she know about all this? Why had she allowed her son to marry me so soon after losing his fiancée? I thought about calling Christine and telling her everything. But what would I say? "Daughter, I discovered your father was engaged to another woman before me and spent his whole life mourning her." No, that would hurt her. It would make her question everything about childhood, about the family, about the father she had loved. And what good would it do for her to know this now that he was already dead? So I thought about going after answers alone. I thought about looking for people who might have known Isabel, people who had been there when everything happened. But 41 years had already passed. Many people had already died, many had moved from town, and I didn't even know where to start. I stayed in this impasse for several days. In the morning, I would wake up with the intention of doing something, of going after information, but then the day would pass and I wouldn't do anything. I just walked around the house, looking at the box under the bed, rereading the letters, looking at the photos, trying to find clues that would lead me somewhere. It was on a Wednesday, almost 3 weeks after opening the box, that I gathered courage. I woke up determined. I would go to the cemetery. I would find Isabel's grave. I needed to see with my own eyes. I needed to face what had haunted my marriage for 40 years. I got dressed, took my purse, and went. The cemetery was on the other side of town, about a 20-minute walk from my house. I passed by the church, the square, Mr. Zach's bakery. People greeted me, asked how I was doing after Theodore's death. I smiled, said I was fine, that life went on. Lie. Life wasn't going on. Life was stuck in that moment when I had opened that box. I arrived at the cemetery when the sun was already strong. The gatekeeper, Mr. Lawrence, an elderly man with white hair who had worked there for decades, saw me and took off his hat in respect. He gave me his condolences again, said Theodore had been a good man, that God was taking care of him. I thanked him and asked if he knew where the grave of a young woman named Isabel Mendez was, who had been buried there in August 1964. Mr. Lawrence scratched his head, thought for a moment, and said the name sounded familiar, but it had been so long he wasn't sure. He said he had a record book there in his guardhouse where everything was noted, all the burials since the cemetery had been inaugurated in 1952. We went to the guardhouse, a small room with a table, a chair, and several shelves full of old, dusty notebooks. He searched until he found the 1964 notebook. He opened it, ran his fingers over the yellowed pages, and stopped at August. He went through the notes until he found it. Isabel Mendez, 20 years old, buried August 24, 1964, Section B, Lot 17. I memorized it and thanked him. Mr. Lawrence told me to be careful because that part of the cemetery was older and somewhat abandoned, full of weeds, some broken headstones. I walked slowly through Section B. He was right. That area was completely different from the new part where Theodore had been buried. The graves were simpler, many with only wooden crosses that had already rotted over time. There was grass growing between the graves, some covered with dry leaves. I counted the lots until I reached 17. When I got there, I almost couldn't believe it. Isabel's grave was impeccable. The difference between it and all the others around was striking. There wasn't a blade of grass. The white marble headstone was clean, shining. There were fresh flowers on top, white roses, the same white roses she held in the bouquet in the photo I had seen. I knelt in front of the grave. I read the inscription, Isabel Mendez, 1944-1964, beloved daughter, fiancé, friend, rest in peace in the arms of the Lord. There was a little angel carved at the top of the headstone. I ran my hand over the cold marble. It was so well maintained, so clean. How? Then I understood. Theodore. It had been Theodore. During all those years, even married to me, even living a completely different life, he came here. He took care of her grave, cleaned it, put flowers on it, kept everything beautiful, as if she were still his fiancée, as if he still had the obligation to take care of her. I remembered that Sunday afternoon, a few days before he died, when he said he was going for a walk alone and was out all day. He had come here. He had come to say goodbye to her. He had come to tell her he was tired, that he couldn't take it anymore, that soon he would meet her again. I sat there on the ground, next to the grave, and started talking. I know it might seem crazy to talk to a dead person I never knew, but I needed to. I needed to say the things that had been stuck in my throat for weeks. I told her who I was. I said I had been the woman who married Theodore, that I had lived with him for 40 years, that I had a daughter with him. I said he never loved me, that he spent his whole life loving her, keeping her memories, visiting her grave. I said that for all those years I didn't know why he was so distant, so cold, so sad, and that now I knew, now I understood. I told her I wasn't angry at her or him, that I understood that the love they had was real, was strong, was the kind of love that doesn't die, not even when the person dies. I said I had been envious when I saw the photos, when I read the letters, because I had never been loved that way, but that I had also felt gratitude in some strange way, because at least now I knew it hadn't been my fault, that I hadn't failed as a wife. I had just been the second choice of a man who never wanted second choices. I cried there, sitting on the ground of that old cemetery, in front of the grave of a woman I had never seen, but who had owned my husband's heart. I cried for everything that could have been different. I cried for the 18-year-old girl I was when I married, full of hope that marriage would bring happiness. I cried for the 58-year-old woman I was now, who had spent her whole life next to someone, but had been alone the entire time. I stayed there for hours. When I finally got up, my legs were numb. I cleaned my face, arranged the flowers that were on the grave, and said goodbye. I told her I would take care of her things, that I would honor what she and Theodore had, and that I would let them finally be together. I left the cemetery with my head full of thoughts. On the way home, I passed in front of Mrs. Helen's house. She lived in a small, light green house with a jabuticaba tree in the yard. I stopped, looked at the house. Mrs. Helen was already quite elderly, must have been about 85. She had been widowed a long time ago. She lived alone there with a niece who came to take care of her every day. I knocked on the door. The niece, Nancy, opened it, recognized me immediately, and made that pitying face people make when they see a recent widow. She invited me in, said Mrs. Helen was in the bedroom resting, but that she would wake her because she would be happy to see me. I waited in the living room. There were photos hanging on the wall, old photos. I saw some photos of Theodore as a child. There was a photo of his first communion, all dressed up in a white suit. There was a photo of him as a teenager holding a big fish he must have caught. And then I saw another photo. It was young Theodore with someone in his early 20s next to a young woman. The same young woman from the photos in the box, Isabel. They were in front of this same house where I was now. He was in a suit, she in a dress, both smiling, so the family knew. Of course they knew. That photo was hanging there on the wall of his mother's house. It wasn't a secret, or at least it wasn't a secret to them. Mrs. Helen appeared supported by Nancy's arm. She was thinner than the last time I had seen her at Theodore's funeral. Her hair completely white, her face full of wrinkles, her hands trembling a little, but her eyes were still lively, alert. She saw me and smiled in that sad way she always smiled. We sat on the sofa. Nancy brought coffee and cookies. We talked about pleasantries for a few minutes. She asked how I was, if I was managing to sleep, if Christine was coming to visit me. I answered everything mechanically because my head was somewhere else. Then, gathering all the courage I had, I asked. I asked about Isabel. Mrs. Helen stopped with the coffee cup in the air, froze, looked at me with those eyes full of surprise. Then she slowly put down the cup, folded her hands in her lap, and sighed deeply. She asked how I knew about Isabel. I told her about the box, about the photos, the letters, the ring, the newspaper, about how I had spent 40 years seeing Theodore take that box every dawn without ever knowing what was inside, and about how finally, after he died, I had opened it. Mrs. Helen began to cry. Crying, she apologized. She apologized for allowing her son to marry me so soon after the tragedy. She said that, at the time, she thought she was doing the right thing, that she thought if Theodore had a new wife, a family, he would be able to get over it, that she thought it was cruel to let a young, strong, hard-working man waste away with sadness for the rest of his life, that Father Anthony had said it was God's will, that God had other plans for him, that he needed to move on. She said Theodore had resisted at first, that when his father, Mr. Otis, had suggested marriage to me, Theodore had said he didn't want to, that he wasn't ready, that he would never be ready. But the family had insisted, had pressured, had said he couldn't spend the rest of his life in mourning, that Isabel wouldn't want to see him like that he needed to honor her memory by living, not dying slowly. And then he had given in, had agreed to marry me. But Mrs. Helen said she always knew it had been a mistake, because from the day of our wedding, Theodore became even more closed off, even sadder. He fulfilled his obligations as a husband and father, but was dead inside. And she, as a mother, had to see that every day and live with the guilt of having forced that. I asked if she knew about the box, if she knew he visited Isabel's grave. She said yes, that Theodore had never hidden that from her, that he went to the cemetery every week, sometimes twice a week, to take care of the grave, that he bought flowers with his own money and took them there, that he never let anyone touch that grave. It was like a sacred mission for him. She said Isabel's family had left town a few years after her death, that the parents couldn't bear to continue living in the place where they had lost their daughter that way, that they had moved to Detroit and never came back, and that since then, Theodore had taken care of the grave alone for more than 40 years. Mrs. Helen held my hands, her old trembling hands holding mine, and she said I had been a better wife than her son deserved, that I had stayed there firm, taking care of him, raising our daughter, keeping the house, even without receiving the love every woman deserves to receive, that she had always been grateful that I stayed, because she knew many women wouldn't have stayed. I told her I never thought about leaving, because back then it wasn't like that. We married for life. It didn't matter if we were happy or not, it didn't matter if we were loved or not. We stayed because that's what was expected of a good woman, and also because somehow I had created an affection for Theodore. It wasn't romantic love, but it was companionship, it was habit, it was a shared life, even if each of us was living in our own solitude. I talked with Mrs. Helen for more than 2 hours. She told me about what Isabel was like. She said she was a cheerful young woman, full of life, who sang all the time, that she and Theodore had met at the church's summer festival in 1963, that it had been love at first sight, that within a few weeks they were already talking about marriage, that everyone in town said they were the perfect couple, that they were made for each other. She told me about the day of the death, how someone had come running to their house, screaming that there had been an accident at the river. How Theodore had run out, how he had arrived there and seen her body being pulled from the water, how he had thrown himself on top of the body, screaming her name, begging her to wake up, how it had taken 6 men to get him off the body and take him home, how he had been locked in his room for days, without eating, without drinking, just crying. She told me that on the day that would have been the wedding, Theodore had put on his wedding suit, put on his tie, combed his hair, put on his shoes, and gone to the church. He had stood there in front of the altar, alone, looking at the empty place where Isabel should have been. Father Anthony had tried to make him leave, but he stood there for hours until it got dark. He only left when he couldn't stand anymore and fainted. Hearing all of that broke my heart again, but at the same time made me understand even more. Theodore wasn't a cold man. He was a broken man. Broken in a way that never got fixed. When I left Mrs. Helen's house, it was already late afternoon. I walked home slowly, processing everything I had heard. Now I had the complete story, not just the fragments from the box, but the whole story, and knowing that changed something in me. It changed how I saw Theodore. It changed how I saw our marriage. It changed how I saw myself. Because now I understood that we had been victims. Victims of circumstances. Victims of expectations. Victims of an era that didn't believe in prolonged grief. That thought marriage was the solution to everything. That pushed people forward even when they needed time to heal. And this understanding, as painful as it was, also brought liberation. Because now I could forgive. Forgive him for never loving me. Forgive myself for never being enough. Forgive life for not being what I dreamed. In the days following my conversation with Mrs. Helen, something changed inside me. It wasn't a sudden change, one of those you feel from one hour to the next. It was a slow change, like when the tide rises on the beach and you only realize the water has already covered your feet when you look down. I was transforming. I was ceasing to be the Dorothy who had lived 40 years in the shadow of a ghost to become a Dorothy I didn't know very well yet. I returned to the cemetery several times that week. I visited Theodore's grave first, talked to him, told him how my day had been, arranged the flowers, and then went to Isabel's grave. I sat there for a while in silence, just feeling the wind on my face and listening to the birds singing in the trees around. It was strange how that place had become important to me. A place where I should never have any connection had become a refuge, a space where I could process everything I was feeling. One afternoon, I was sitting there between the 2 graves when a lady I didn't know came by. She was about my age, graying hair pulled back in a bun, simple polka-dot dress. She passed by me carrying a watering can and went to a grave several lots ahead. She began watering the flowers she had planted there. After a while, she looked at me and smiled. She came in my direction. She introduced herself as Carmen. She said she came there every week to take care of her husband's grave, Mr. Edward, who had died 5 years ago from a stroke. She asked if I was visiting any relative. I pointed to Theodore's grave and said it was my husband. She made that sympathetic face, said she knew how difficult it was, that at first it seemed like life wouldn't continue, but that with time, we learned to live with the absence. We talked for a few minutes. She was nice, easy to talk to. Then she looked at the other grave, Isabel's, which was right next to where I was sitting. She commented on how that grave was always so well-maintained, so full of flowers. She said that for years she had seen a man coming there regularly, always alone, always bringing white roses. She had thought it was beautiful, all that devotion. It must have been the father or brother of the young woman, she had thought. My heart tightened. It was Theodore she had seen all those years, my husband taking care of the grave of the woman he really loved. And nobody knew. To everyone, he was just a devoted man paying respects to someone. No one imagined the pain behind that. I told Carmen that I knew the story, that the man she had seen was my husband, that the young woman in the grave had been his fiancée before he married me. Her eyes widened. She didn't know what to say. She was speechless for a moment. Then she carefully asked if I wasn't hurt by that, by him coming here all those years. I thought carefully before answering. I explained that for a long time I hadn't known, that I had discovered everything only after he died, and that now, knowing the complete story, I couldn't be hurt. I could only feel enormous sadness for everyone involved. For Isabel, who died so young, for Theodore, who never recovered from the loss, and for me, who lived a life next to someone who could never give me his heart, because his heart was buried here. Carmen hugged me. It was a strong, tight hug from someone who understood pain, even without having gone through the same situation. She said I was a woman of great strength, that not just anyone could look at all this with so much understanding. I thanked her, but inside I didn't feel strong. I felt just tired of carrying so much alone for so long. When I returned home that day, I sat on the porch and watched the sunset. The sky was orange and pink with some dark clouds on the horizon. It was beautiful. Theodore used to sit in this same chair every afternoon and stare at nothing while he smoked. Now I understood he wasn't staring at nothing. He was looking at the past. He was seeing Isabel in every sunset, in every cloud, in every breeze. I went inside when it got dark. I went straight to the bedroom. I took the box from under the bed again. I had looked at that so many times. I knew every photo, every word of every letter. But I needed to look one more time. I needed to make the decision that had been circling in my head since the day I discovered everything.